Welcome back, everybody, to the OIS Retina Podcast. Again, this is Firas Rahhal, a partner at Retina-Vitreous Associates in Los Angeles and partner at Excite Ventures centered in New York, your host. And I'm delighted today to have a very close personal friend of mine as the guest, also a brilliant guy who also practices with me part-time, Dr. Alex Walsh. Alex is on in his capacity, among other things, as CEO and founder of Envision Diagnostics. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But again, to the point, Alex is also still a part-time practicing medical retina specialist, full transparency, here in LA with us at Retina-Vitreous Associates. Welcome, Alex, and thank you for coming to the program.
Thanks for the invitation, Craig. And for us, it's good to be here. Nice to actually be on the podcast that I've listened to before.
I'm glad you've listened. I'll take your private critiques later. I didn't know you were listening, but I'm glad to hear it. So a little background on you that I'll go into, and then I want to hear about, those early days with you and your early part of your career, but your training and background, BS in mechanical engineering from Stanford, an MD from Columbia University, what those of us who've been in New York for many years call PNS. No one says Columbia there. They all say PNS, as you know. Residency at the Wilmer Eye Institute and fellowship at the Doheny Eye Institute, which at the time was part of USC. Alex, your parents were obviously very disappointed. You're quite an underachiever. How did they ever make it through those really terrible institutions?
Well, I always said I wanted to go back to California, but I kept moving away, and then I finally made it back. And my wife and I didn't plan on staying in LA, but we stayed for 17 years, so it wasn't too hard of a decision.
We're glad you did. You then, right out of training, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, joined the full-time faculty at USC. That's when I got to know you as a full-time faculty member. And in those early days, let's get right into some of the things you were doing. You have a ton of experience in OCT and the engineering of OCT. I know that's what some of the work you were doing at USC. Can you give us some of the history around this work that you were doing at USC at that time, right out of fellowship, or maybe it started while you were a fellow?
Well, it's interesting to think back, and it's ancient history. But when I was a resident, I had one of the faculty members at my institution tell me that OCT was the crutch for the weak clinician. So we had no OCT training during residency, because that was the days of OCT 1 and OCT 2. So when I came out to Doheny, they actually had an OCT 1 device that was sitting in the back room, nobody used. But that was right as OCT 3, the Stratus OCT, was coming out. And that immediately distinguished itself because, not only could we measure macular holes nicely, but I think that the real thing that sold me on it was vitreomacular traction. I saw a ton of patients that had unexplained vision loss, and you could clearly see in the OCT that had vitreomacular traction. And I think a good clinician looking very closely might have seen something similar, but it was great. That was a diagnosis that really was born out of the OCT era and convinced me that OCT was going to be the way forward for macular disease. So that was 2003. And then in 2005, Topcon actually approached me, because they were trying to develop their first spectrodomain OCT instrument. And David Wong was also working at USC Doheny on a spectrodomain instrument. So we actually had a group of early spectrodomain OCT prototypes at Doheny, which was wonderful, because that's what I did a lot of work on. It sold me on the technology and also allowed me to gain a better understanding of the benefits of high-speed OCT and spectrodomain OCT. And I just transitioned all of my research emphasis right towards that, because it was so obvious it was going to take over.
So it was clear to you it was going to be very important. Did you already know at that early stage of your career you were planning a full-time academic career right out of fellowship, or did this sort of evolve because of some of this work?
Well, I was my father's an academic physician. He's a lifelong chairman, and I assumed that I would be an academic physician for my whole career. So when I first started this, I never had any idea that I would leave academic medicine to do this. I thought this would be the focus of academic research, and it wasn't until the fall of 2007 when I was working on retinal screening at the time, because as you know, in LA we have a population of patients that that are underserved and overworked, and these people don't come in to see us until they have bilateral vitreous hemorrhages. And I'd seen one too many of those, and I thought, if we could catch these people in a pharmacy at 2 a.m. when they're getting off of their third job, and we could actually pick up on that NVD, we might actually save their vision and help everybody. So I actually thought that was the fall of 2007 is when I came up with the idea for a binocular retinal OCT system that would be placed in a pharmacy for people to use 24 hours a day. They buy a $10 card from the counter and stick it in there, and it would actually refer them to a retina doctor if they had macular disease. So when I thought of that was too compelling of an idea for me to purely do that in an academic environment. We actually started what's called an L3C, which is a hybrid between a 501c3 and an LLC at Doheny. We set up a company within the sort of 501c3 construct to try to develop this instrument as a venture, but it just, there was no way to really make that work. So the transition from academics to the industry was a slow transition for me, but it was kind of inevitable given what I saw as the power of these ideas to help the world.
So initially, it was going to be an academic project, and you found that the reality was to take it the full distance, you had to spin it out. And we've heard this before from others, and it's sort of my bias. Maybe it's the American capitalist machine sort of teaching me how to bring things along. But do you think it's possible to bring along a product like this the whole way in an academic center? Is it even possible?
Well, I think there are a couple barriers. One, probably the biggest barrier I found is whenever I went to talk to a company about a partnership or a potential future collaboration, they first of all would say, do you have the authority to negotiate this on behalf of the university? But the second most important question was, what's the intellectual property status? Because if the intellectual property is held by the university, we don't want any part of it. And it was very hard for some of these companies to negotiate license agreements with some universities. And they were so once bitten, twice shy about that if we had university-based IP, they just didn't want to touch it. So that was one problem. And then, the fundraising problem is really a challenge because you can get gifts given to universities, but equity investments are a whole different thing. And to the kind of funding you need for a project like this is hard to get purely from NIH and from private donors. So bringing in money in the right, using the right vehicles to launch the product, and then having partners have faith that your intellectual property and the foundation of the invention is a monetizable thing in the future. Those were challenges, and we did not overcome them. And so that's why I just had to leave and go out and to start it privately, because there was no way to push it forward in university. Others may succeed. It's not, my failure doesn't mean everyone else fails, but I ran into a lot of the same problems that other people do. And I think it's very hard to launch these things within a university context.
So is it fair to say at that time, when you formed Envision, it was called Envision, I'm assuming from the beginning, Envision Diagnostics, did you have to license the IP from USC? Did USC originally own the IP, and then there was a licensing agreement in the early days?
Well, there was a complicated arrangement between the Doheny Eye Institute and USC that had a collaboration, and there was an IP sharing agreement. I won't go into the details, but fortunately, USC allowed Doheny to lead. But I negotiated a license agreement personally when I left. I licensed the IP myself. I had to pay for it. And but that allowed me then, when I started the company, to license the IP to the company, as opposed to Envision Diagnostics having to go license it from Doheny. So I was the intermediary. I'm sure there are other ways to do that, but in this case, I licensed the IP myself and then licensed it to the company when I set up the company.
Totally understood. That makes sense. That's actually a pretty unique story, but the licensing part always becomes part of the challenge going through the tech transfer. And I do think the vast majority of drugs and devices ultimately make their way out through this same process or a similar process. Let's talk a little bit about the device itself. We'll get a little more current. How did those early versions, your early conceptualization of the device, and I didn't know that about the retail, because that has been talked about with your device now, and we may come back to this. How did that early conceptualization then evolve into what it is now? And maybe you can spend a little more time on telling us what it is now, the tests it does, how it does them, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting evolution of the idea, because one of the problems that I saw with fundus photo screening, which is another area that I researched for many years in academics, was that patients felt that they were getting an eye exam when really all they were having was a macular exam. And they could have glaucoma, they could have cataracts, they could have any other number of diseases in the eye that were missed. And I realized the same problem was going to exist with our retinal OCT. We're just going to take a small picture, we're going to miss glaucoma, we're going to miss cataracts. And so I started to think, how could we mitigate that? And actually, the original patent involved surrogate ways of detecting cataracts and other things. But about a month or two after I thought of the binocular OCT idea, I realized that if we could image the front of the eye, we could solve all those problems as well. And so the evolution of an anterior-posterior OCT came about because I wanted to be able to see the angle and the lens and the cornea and the pupil. And when you enable that, you have the ability now to do all these exams. I thought, we can measure the pupils, we can measure motility. So I remember it was right before ARVO of 2008. And I was just almost every day I was thinking of more tests we could do with anterior OCT. And I went to ARVO and started talking to all my friends about it, and they thought I had lost my mind because had never even, OCT can't do that. So that was one piece of it that sort of started the idea of the whole eye exam being encapsulated in this instrument instead of just retinal OCT. But between 2008 and 2010, I traveled around the world to try to get interest from other countries and foundations. I actually spent a lot of time in China and India, because that's where I saw the root of the problem being in the future of eye care. I thought all these diabetics in India are going to need early detection and treatment, and same thing in rural China. So why not go there and try to raise money from foundations? So I met with Wellcome Trust, Hilton Foundation, Gates Foundation, and I am obviously not a very good salesman because I was totally unsuccessful at convincing them. I had one person look me in the eye and say, trachoma is more important than diabetic retinopathy in India. And I said, 20 years ago, I would absolutely agree with you, but right now this is a problem. Yeah. And I didn't have a lot of success. And I was able to find a friend of our family's who basically said to me, if it's too risky to do screening, well, look, there are no screening models out there. The pharmacy idea is great, but how are you going to pay for it? Show me the model where this works and we know how to build a business on that. And same thing with Asia. Show me how you can build a device here and protect the intellectual property in Asia and launch a profitable business there. And he said, if you are willing to focus first on the markets that we know, Europe, America, and industrialized Asia, then I'll help you start the company. So I had this choice. Of whether I was going to keep pursuing this dream of a screening instrument in an environment that was not pro-screening at the time and in countries where I was unfamiliar with a lot of the systems and the way they worked, or whether I was going to go for a clinical instrument that could be used first in clinics in the industrialized world and then eventually move to the developing world. So I chose that because we actually had a path forward. And he believed that business model was good. And so he was our early supporter in the instrument. That's how we launched the company.
And in the early days, I'm sure there were a few tests. Now there are many tests, or maybe they were all from the beginning. What are the tests that let's go right to now. So what are the tests that you have inside this one box? I know it's a all-in-one. Some people who are listening may be familiar with you and the product. It's a eye exam, sort of start to finish, including all eye OCT, but maybe a little more specifically than that. What are the tests and how is it actually used in the clinic?
Yeah. So it's so as you said, it's a binocular OCT instrument, which is a sort of first of its kind. It measures both eyes at once, and it does whole eye OCT. So it images the front, middle, and back of the eye. I'd say all the way from the eyelashes to the choroid, and it's swept source OCT. So that's the foundation technology is allowing you to image the entire eye at every exam. In retina, we've seen the benefits of being able to look back at prior exams. You can't do that with a slit lamp, and you can't make quantitative measurements with a slit lamp. And there's so many shortcomings to the slit lamp. This is something that I'm convinced will replace the slit lamp. And when I started giving talks on OCT biomicroscopy back in 2009, and it was treated somewhat as blasphemy back then, but I think now people are recognizing that there's a real opportunity here. So the foundation is binocular whole eye OCT, but I think the real novel thing about it is that we use OCT to make other measurements. So I think that the goal for the instrument is to have an automated device that does essentially what our technicians would do, but without the need to have a technician asking for letters and trying to estimate pupil sizes with a muscle light. And the human beings are not very good at making those kinds of measurements. There's a layer of interpretation. There's a lot of subjectivity and variability. And as you know, a lot of the data we get back is poor in quality. So the idea is to have OCT make these measurements objectively, repeatably, reproducibly every single time, no matter where you are. So if you get an MRI in China and you come to the US and get an MRI in the same machine, you can compare those exams head to head. It's so easy to do that. But in ophthalmology, you and I in the same practice can't compare slit lamp exams because we do them differently. So the idea was to standardize how we capture data and then to do the tests that doctors need. So the most common exam done in the US is a comprehensive eye exam, the 92014 exam. And that has requirements of measuring vision and confrontation visual fields and motility and alignment. So we tried to build our core exam around the most common exam that doctors do that would allow them to get the entire workup done automatically without having to enlist technicians to do that. The technicians can come further in the back office and help them take care of patients. You don't need a human being asking, TZVE. So this is a device that really does the tests fundamentally that we need for our most common eye exams, but then can be extended to do almost any test that you can imagine in the eye, be it static or kinetic perimetry, contrast sensitivity, color vision. Most of the devices in our clinic are the same. There's some kind of input unit, there's a power unit, there is some logic involved in it. If you took them all apart, they would all have the same basic components, yet somehow we ask device companies to make them all separate devices. It doesn't make sense. Just like a smartphone has changed the number of devices we carry with us, a single device can use the same hardware platform to do all these tests and software. That was the fundamental idea that allows us to do visual acuity, autorefraction, confrontation fields, motility, pupillometry, color vision. But as you know, the list goes on to 50 or 60 tests, but you do it all in one instrument in one place so the patient doesn't have to move. As you know, I see a lot of AMD, and my patients are sometimes elderly and slow, and it's not easy to move these patients around from screening room to OCT to other places. You put them once in front of the machine, turn it on, let them do their exam and leave. 6 minutes later, the whole thing is done. You don't have to move them or put them in a sub-waiting room. It's a more efficient way of doing eye care. And I think if a systems engineer came into our clinics to look at how we run things, they would tear their hair out because we need to bring more lean processes into what we're doing. And this is a step in that direction. I think there are other ways to do it, but certainly it's one of the things we try to do is streamline the visit process so the visits are faster, patients are happier, and we get better data.
There's no question about your systems engineer comment. Actually, just in the most plain terms, I have had patients over the years come through, and these are smart people who might not be systems engineers, but they're even semi-technologically aware, and they watch this process and then endure it themselves over the amount of minutes to hours that it takes and the moving from room to room. And the word that keeps coming to mind for me is it's so linear, and they see that. And in an era where they can go on their iPhone and solve myriad problems all at once with several screens open at the same time, like booking a reservation and calling someone. We're still moving, 90-year-olds from room to room. It is really linear and we're laughing about it, but it's just too slow. It's too old-fashioned. We have to move on from this if we're ever going to service the tens of millions of patients we're going to service, which we'll come to shortly with new drugs that we'll talk about. This, I think, helps to solve this problem. How do you view this device then in the hands of a practicing ophthalmologist or optometrist, retina or otherwise, and how they will incorporate it into their practice and how it will help them?
Your comment about linearity is right on point. When we ask our technician to take a patient to a screening room, that technician is now tied up for that entire process, and then they move them on one at a time. And when you look at lean manufacturing processes, one of the ways to decrease your cycle time is to parallelize processes. So once you take the technician out of that room, our instrument can be put in that room, but the technician loads the patient on that instrument and then walks out. That technician is now free to do other things. And that one technician can put people on 3 different instruments at once. So now you've got one person doing the work of 3 technicians, and our machine doesn't take vacation, eat lunch, or go to the bathroom. So our machine has full duty cycle. So, our machine can easily see 40 or 50 people a day. And it's, you can run 3 of them at once. So with one sort of concierge level technician and 3 machines, you could easily work up 150 patients a day. With one technician. Name a technician who can do that. None of our super techs do that. So parallelization is a really key part of this, and trying to remove any kind of waiting, latent periods or waiting periods. It's really important. But as you said, every doctor is going to want to use this a little differently. And we don't want people to have to change their behavior in order to use this instrument. None of us are good at changing our behavior. My wife reminds me of that all the time. So, I think depending on, I'll make some stereotypes here, but, for an optometrist who's got a set pre-test workup that they do, and then time spent with the patient, where they'd rather have them in an optical shop, or they'd rather have time to work with them on the things that really matter to them. I feel like boiling this down into a small square footage, instrument. This is just 2 by 2 square feet, where it does everything in a small space because they pay for expensive retail space. Doing things like subjective refraction and autorefraction, that's wavefront autorefraction for them, giving lots of data so that they can manage complex medical diseases that they may not see every day. Every one of my patients has AMD or advanced diabetes, but I imagine optometry sees a smaller percentage of advanced AMD. But with an instrument like ours, they have all the tools that every retina specialist has, and they can do complex evaluations no matter who walks in the door. And for some optical companies, they don't want to have an optometrist at every location all the time. So this helps them diversify their coverage for eye exams. So I think on the front lines, be it comprehensive ophthalmology, optometry, there are a lot of advantages to having an all-in-one device that gives great data. But for in the tertiary care and subspecialty offices like ours, we just have an army of people. As you know, it's a sea of people and devices, and it's not, as you said, it's not lost on our patients. They go see their internist, and there's one nurse, and then the internist walks in the room, and they come see us, and they can't keep the name straight because there are 6 or 7 people to interact with. So for us, it's a matter of streamlining our operations, decreasing our payroll if we can, or more importantly, taking the techs that we can't live without and bringing them closer to us. We all have those people that know our patients and know our patterns, and we trust to counsel patients and help us set up for procedures. That's what we want. We want a technician to help us deliver care, not sit in a screening room and do things that a human being isn't required to do. So I think for the tertiary care person, it's more about efficiency and labor reduction, and also good numbers. We don't get the best visions. This instrument can give clinical trials level data on every single patient. And I think that's something we should be demanding. We spend 3 times as much on labor as we do on devices, and we just accept that as the cost of doing business. And I hope that people, at least from looking at ventures like this, will get the idea that they need to start demanding more from device companies. Give us automated devices. Help us with the problems that really plague us, such as, labor. It's hard to hire people. It's hard to retain good people. And the device companies have been slow to do that because doctors haven't asked loudly enough for it. It's a bit like moving from gas vehicles to electric vehicles. You got to have the right pressure on the industry to get what you want. And if we all banded together as ophthalmologists and said, we need fewer people and better machines and better data, I think the device industry would respond.
You're so right. And I sort of semi-laughed when you said no bathroom break, no lunch, no vacation. And I thought immediately myself and Dave Boyer. So I think their doctors too could use a little break and help from the linearity. We're suffering under this mighty volume. And to that point, the HR shortages that we have now are tremendous. I know you and I have talked about this at Retina-Vitreous. We've been essentially hiring 24/7. The door is always open since even before the pandemic, but most certainly after the pandemic. I think in your travels now and researching what practices are doing and helping you to develop this device, you've seen a drastic shortage of HR availability for ophthalmology. Is that right?
Yeah, the Great Resignation is plaguing us all, and it's one thing if you run a fast food restaurant and have trouble retaining employees, but for us, we have to train them, and once they develop some proficiency in what they do, if they leave the following week, we just lost all that work. So we are constantly hiring, we're training, and then they're leaving, and we're hiring again, and it affects the quality of our data. My patients don't like it. They see new faces all the time, and this person doesn't seem to know what they're doing, and they lose faith in me because the people that they interact with in the office are so important in the visit quality. So I think it hurts us all when we don't have a stable, high quality system that we can rely on consistently between visits, because patients notice it, and we certainly notice it in our data quality.
100%. I want to stay on the data topic, but turn a little bit to the broader picture and the broader quote big data discussion. And again, you and I have talked about this. Everyone's talked about this in recent months and years. Doctors in decision making, big pharma in deciding how to promote or use their products most effectively, device companies. Everyone's interested in big data, insurance companies, federal payer system, and the big data, so to speak, at least I can speak for ophthalmology, thus far has been pretty poor. I no offense to my friends who are in that line of work, but the heterogeneity of the data, of the EMR systems, of the poor quality technical information being put in by the human tech who may not know how to take out proper visual acuity, all this adds up to really pretty poor big data. How do you see this product and this kind of homogeneity of information helping in this regard?
Yeah, I think, as you said, it isn't any one particular group or person's fault. It's just the source is noisy and sometimes just low quality, and everything that stems from that ends up suffering from that quality problem. I think the big data potential to move the field forward is tremendous, and we're not taking advantage of it because we're providing such poor data. We have some of the worst data, I believe, in medicine. There are some other fields that are a little more subjective, but I mean, can you imagine if your doctor told you your cholesterol was mild, moderate, or severe, or your blood sugar, 1+, 2+, or 3+? We cannot keep using these assessments. Internists have blood tests. They have blood pressure. They have quantitative results. And in defense of our industry, yes, we now have structural imaging, but on the functional side, it's very poor. So, I think there are a couple aspects to data that need to be fixed in order for us to take greatest advantage of this. And one is the quality of the data needs to be improved. And even clinical trials struggle to get good quality data. They do the best job, of any of us, but it's at great cost. We need clinical trial quality data in our clinical operations, I believe. And an instrument like ours, we measure hundreds and thousands of measurements in a 6-minute exam and when our techs give us 2 or 3. To give you an example, and I don't want to digress too much, but when we measure vision, we also measure the time it takes for someone to respond to each letter. Because we know as clinicians that when you're testing someone and they read TZVE, you know that person's 20/20. But when someone's struggling, I think that's a T.
Right.
That might be they're both going to get 20/20, but one person's having a lot more trouble than the other. So just the surrogate reading speed measure of time of response is a very useful thing. We can measure letter confusion, whether you're confusing an F and a P or an L and an X. That really, it depends on your disease. Your best fixation stability comes when you're looking at a 20/20 letter. We measure the fixation of the eye when you're looking at the smallest letter, and that is the best fixation you will ever get out of a patient. So if you want to know someone's maximum fixation stability, you do it on the smallest letter they can read. So there are all these measurements that not only do you measure visual acuity well, but you make sure you measure everything about the eye when it's happening. And it gives us tremendous surrogate measures that we can use across all of our disease studies to improve our description of the phenotype. We poorly describe the disease phenotype. This allows us to describe it better. So one aspect of data is the quality of the data. The other aspect is the sharing of the data. And, HIPAA, which is a very good rule to protect our patients, puts up necessary barriers and it prevents data sharing. So it's, we all have been in the situation where we get a faxed OCT from some referring doctor and it's just black and you can't see anything that they saw that day. And, did so-and-so send the records? No, I don't see those records. They haven't arrived yet. That's not a good way to take care of people. So, an instrument like ours, we actually de-identify all the data and we share it so that patients now can control who sees the data and they can share their data with every doctor. The patients have access to it. Once you break down the barriers and you give them high quality data, my hope is that they'll be able to aggregate all their data from every provider and share it with every provider so that when they walk into your clinic for the first time, you get all the exams from every eye doctor they've seen before you, and you have that entire history in front of you in making a decision about them, as opposed to having them fill out some record transfer and it comes in 2 months and you can't read it. So, I think that data sharing is important and data quality is important. We can do better on both. We're trying our own way, and I know other companies are trying too, but it's a hill we have to climb in order to make progress in the field of ophthalmology.
It's incredible, actually, when I hear it phrased the way you correctly phrase it. It's almost embarrassing that this is how we handle record keeping. And it's universally true that the patient comes in, has done their diligence to get the records sent before they come. And unequivocally, that's the discussion that happens. And we're covering our tracks like, well, it didn't really come and we don't have it, and it's worthless. And that's sad in the current state of, the world of technology. We should be doing better with this and a million other things. I'm glad that you're trying to tackle that. This has become somewhat of a software discussion, which is well outside of my skill set. But in that regard, does this incorporate AI for next level sort of data analysis then too, for, let's say, aggregate decision making by doctors and or drug companies, insurance companies, et cetera, about healthcare?
Yeah, AI is a really important and enormous topic to talk about. It's inevitable now that this is going to impact our field. And I remember at one of our conferences, I gave a talk on AI right after Google published their paper where they could identify the gender of the subject from a fundus photo, which is something we can't do as clinicians. And that's when I said, we finally have passed the mark where machines will be able to do things that we can't. I think right now they're kind of on par with us, but very, very soon they will surpass us. And we need to make sure that that's a good thing for patient care. So when it comes to diagnostic interpretation, we were talking before this about, GA and what's happening with all the exciting new potential therapies in GA. It's possible that AI will play an important role in assessing structure and progression of disease in GA. And one of the challenges there is how do you standardize that across all these device companies? We all have different OCT machines. How do we get the same answer out of all of them? And do we have to, hire some service online to do it? We've taken a different approach. We actually do AI right on our machine. I think we might be the only machine that does inference on the device itself. And that's something we need to do. We've been doing that for a couple of years, but I think it has some advantages. But however we do it, we're going to need to incorporate AI into our practice in real time. But then the next phase of it is, how does AI interact with our data systems to help us make discoveries and take better care of patients? And again, having that central high quality data set is going to be a key piece of AI discoveries. And I think that will take us to the next level in new diagnoses. At the beginning of this, I talked about how OCT ushered in, the diagnosis of vitreomacular traction. I think there are dozens of diseases of the eye that we're missing right now that AI is going to show us what they are. And it's not going to name them for us, but it's going to say, look, this pattern of abnormalities, this is a syndrome, and we're going to look at the pathophysiology and say, okay, this is actually a disease that we've been missing all along. So that's exciting. And I think we need to figure out the best ways to use that to take better care of patients, and for us to forward our understanding of the pathophysiology of eye disease. So AI is going to be with us now for the remainder of time, and may one day replace us. I'm not so worried about it replacing you as a retinal surgeon, but it might replace a lot of our interpretation, which in some ways might be a good thing. As I said, 1 + 2 + 3 + is not the future. And if AI can help us get past that, then we need to work as hard as we can on it.
It's inevitable. It'll be like a modern day times a million Don Gass, right? Finding associated symptoms or signs across thousands of people that just picks up a few, and then boom, a new entity. Amazing how he did that without AI, actually.
Well, it's funny. I was just talking to Praveen about this at lunch on Sunday. Can you imagine if Don Gass had OCT? Don Gass made observations nobody else could before OCT. If Don Gass had OCT, we probably would have solved lots of diseases by now. And then AI, that would be a super intelligence. I think it might actually be too much, but that is the goal. Is to give Don Gass level interpretive capabilities to everybody in eye care, whether you're on the front lines or the back line. We all need those same tools. As you said, the demand for eye care in the future is going to be so big. It's all hands on deck right now, as far as I'm concerned. We need to arm everybody with advanced tools to allow them to evaluate complex diseases at the highest standards of care in order for us to be able to differentiate who needs therapy and who doesn't. And if we're going to be injecting more people, I don't know how we're going to do that. Our clinics are already overloaded, as you've pointed out many times, and we can't take on 10 times as many people. So we've got to figure out a better way of delivering care, and hopefully AI will be the tool at just the right time to help us do that.
I'm glad you brought this part of it up with OCT and dry AMD. I spoke with, and he was on the podcast, I think it's airing or about to air, with Ram Polanki, and he elaborated on the early days of Lucentis and how OCT and wet AMD sort of grew up together hand in hand, and OCT's evolution exploded because of the evolving treatments of wet AMD and then shortly thereafter DME.
Yeah.
I'm wondering now, with the onset, we're coming near term for dry AMD treatments. It's going to be an explosion of patient volumes coming in, maybe 10x over the wet AMD numbers, if you believe, the historical epidemiological statistics. Do you see this or other devices exploding onto the scene in the same way that we determined or developed a dependency on OCT for that binary treat, not treat kind of question that we use now for wet AMD? You get the point.
Oh, it's a really profound point. And I'll give a little personal background, maybe too much disclosure here, but my father is a urologist, and he developed the modern surgery for prostate cancer, which spared the nerves and prevented impotence after surgery. That surgery would not have become so commonplace had it not been for the invention of PSA. So PSA became the tool we use to detect prostate cancer, and the treatment was this minimally invasive prostate surgery. So urologists in 1980 did maybe 3 or 4 prostatectomies a year. And by 1990, my father was doing 500 or 600 a year. So, it's the pairing of therapies and diagnostics is essential to both delivery of care, but also to the success of the therapies. And your point about wet AMD is perfect. Without OCT, can you imagine how we would have detected subretinal fluid? We would have been looking at subretinal hemorrhage. There would have been no way to ever pick up on subretinal fluid or the subtle CME that we treat. And if we had detected it, but we couldn't treat it, well, actually, we knew that. We saw that back when all we had was PDT and thermal laser. That was a hard time. So the pairing of those two things was really what allowed the anti-VEGF era to take off. And hopefully pharma recognizes this. Pharma needs to recognize that a therapy without an easily used and widely used diagnostic is going to be limited in its impact. And for them, it's revenue, but for us, it's improving vision. The standard of vision has gone up so far in wet AMD. My patients, I used to tell them move to a place where they could take the bus. And now 20 years in, they're trying to get their driver's license. And, it's a whole different world, which is wonderful. But when it comes to dry AMD, we don't have the smoking gun. Well, I should say intermediate AMD. Intermediate AMD, we don't have the smoking gun that we have with subretinal fluid or CME. This is a disease that's very hard to phenotype right now. Rick Firas tried to make it really simple for us all. And even with a simplified ARID scale, we did a pretty poor job of staging people with intermediate AMD. So, I feel like there is work to be done here. And my hope is that pharma will rise to the occasion, because this is to the benefit of them and their shareholders, but as practitioners, it's actually to the benefit of our patients. Look what happened in wet AMD. If we could do the same thing in an easy way with dry macular degeneration, can you imagine what a wonderful world it would be? I sound like I'm singing a song, but if we have a topical dry AMD therapy that we can diagnose and know exactly when to implement it, even an injectable if it's infrequent, I think these are real opportunities to help people before they lose vision, and but the diagnostics aren't there yet. So and I think that, again, getting back to AI, the way to do this is with AI. That trial, where they showed that they could tell the gender of the patient, that was really instructive to me. I looked back at the literature, and Francois Delory, one of the fathers of lasers in the eye and spectroscopy and spectrometry in the eye, did a study in a few years before, looking at whether macular pigment was different between men and women. And after spending a lot of time working on this, his conclusion was probably it was just barely statistically significant that macular pigment was different in men than women. When you look at the Google result, it was absolutely clear. The heat map showed a difference in the macular pigment between men and women. So if we're going to develop diagnostics, we can't do it through small trials of existing instrumentation. We need real world data at scale. We need tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of eyes using experimental diagnostics to figure out the best way to phenotype intermediate AMD. That's when we'll truly be successful. And I hope we're going to get there. With the right technology applied to this problem, I'm not afraid. I know we can get there. It's just if we keep trying to pull the same tools out of our box, if we go and get our Ishihara color plates out of the drawer and expect that that's going to give us an answer when it's used for male inherited color blindness, that's not the answer to these big questions. And we all need to come together, pharma and technology companies, to solve these problems, because it will result in better vision for our patients and an even higher bar for our 90-year-old patients who are going to be complaining about 2025 vision. So maybe the future isn't so bright if we've got people who set the bar so high. But I personally would enjoy that conversation than the one where I know that they're going to lose vision no matter what I do.
We'll have to develop a retina premium lens analog. We can talk about that separately. It has been bounced around, for years.
Right.
final area, it fits into what we were just talking about, specifically with regard to the device, the Envision device. Where is it in the stage of development right now? And is this a 510K pathway? And if you could, have you had some clinical testing?
Yeah, so we've had some discussions with FDA, and it's premature to declare anything before they agree with your assessment. But this is an OCT device, and they've very smartly set out guidance for multiple function medical device products. And that allows companies to do multiple things on a device, some of which may not be as complicated as other things, without making the whole thing complicated, both for FDA and the company. So we do a lot of class 1 level testing on our device, and the hope is that this will be an OCT, approval with some, class 2 data submission, and then a lot of class 1 functionality that can be added in the future without putting a long FDA process in between us and getting to the customer. So yeah, we've been at this for 11 years. It's a long road. This is a high-tech, complicated device. It's swept source, light sources are just recently stabilized, and so everything's kind of coming together now. We're trying to get our first 510K submitted by the end of next year. But it's been a long road, and we have done testing. We did some testing in LA. We've done a little testing overseas. It was great to run this device on retina clinic patients and see people with severe eye disease and how well they do on a device like this and how acceptable it was. We thought that there'd be a aversion to technology. It was the opposite. They actually felt more confident in this workup than the tech workups, just because it was this precise device. So we've tested several hundred patients now and had very good repeatability and very good clinical results. So our hope is that we'll be able to get through our FDA process in a reasonable time frame and then bring the instrument to the clinical marketplace, which is its own challenge. It's hard to launch devices. It takes money, it takes time, it takes a lot of dedication. We got a great team, but it is a long road and still uncertainties ahead.
Yeah, but I think that the need and the marketability anyway, as a practicing busy retina doctor / ophthalmologist, seems a no-brainer. I think I'm wishing for you to get this done and to get it done as quickly as possible, because I do think the volume of patients we're trying to see and the quality of information we're getting on the standard workup that we see 70 times in a day in our clinics, or 50 or 80, it's terrible. And we need to be much, much better, much, much faster, more efficient. I'm congratulating you on getting this far, and you're really close. And I hope you do get to the FDA approval as soon as possible, because I think there's a lot of ophthalmologists for sure that know this product, that are eagerly anticipating using it literally right away to streamline their practices. I hope it gets through quickly. I congratulate you. And again, Dr. Alex Walsh, my good buddy and the CEO and founder of Envision Diagnostics. Thank you, Alex, for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me, Firas. Nice talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the OIS Podcast. Tune in next week as we chat science, medicine, and industry with ophthalmology's leading experts. Visit OIS.net for more information on podcasts, events, and exciting new features.